Morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out. For those that don't know, my name is Davi Barker. I've been involved in the Liberty Movement for a number of years. I suppose technically I got my start in 2007 on the Ron Paul campaign, although I also campaigned for Ron Paul in 2004. I was the only one. And the reason for that was, at the time, I was engaged in sort of experimenting homelessness, voluntary homelessness, and I spent a lot of time panhandling and doing street performance art and things like that. This is before I discovered any kind of liberty or anything, but it got me thinking about money generally. And I had taken to going to the public library and reading the congressional record, because I figured whatever was going on, the evidence had to be there. And I discovered Ron Paul completely accidentally by reading the congressional record. And he had a speech called The Foolishness of Fiat, which happened to be delivered on my birthday. And it was about fiat money. I'm sure all of you guys know about fiat money. And so that's how I sort of got into the Liberty Movement or the Liberty Mission, or whatever you want to call this thing that has happened. Since then, I've written a number of books. I've represented a number of organizations. People here mostly know me as one of the co-founders of Muslims for Liberty, which is an organization that is designed to sort of explore the confluence of values between sort of traditional Islam and libertarianism, of which there's far more than you would expect, although that's not the topic for today. Also, I'm the co-founder of Bitcoin Not Bombs, which is, again, my interest in money. It's sort of the reversal of the Bastiat expression, if goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. Well, we're making the proposition that if transformative technologies make it impossible for governments to prevent international trade, then it will become increasingly difficult for them to wage war, because your population won't support it if they're going to war with people they're financial actors with. But also, a fiat currency is necessary for war, and so Bitcoin or gold or silver or any alternative free market voluntary currency makes war increasingly difficult. So to this end, I've written a number of books. Voluntary Islam was my first. Authoritarian Sociopathy is a sort of examination of the psychology of power and obedience. That was my second. And since then, I've turned to fiction, and I write zombie novels. And I want to talk a little bit today about why I went from nonfiction to fiction, and why I think that at least for me, is the most effective way to propagate liberty. So I first encountered, not first encounter, I mean, like, propaganda has been a part of my life since I was born. We've been eating, breathing, and shitting it our entire lives in this country. But something that really kind of caught my attention was during the George W. Bush administration, and he said, in my line of work, you've got to keep repeating things over and over again to catapult the propaganda. And I thought, what a wonderful moment of honesty from this wretched human being. And it really solidified for me the point that it's not about whether a thing is true or false. It's about how many times it's repeated and where and by who. That for the most part, people believe or come to believe the things that are repeated over and over and over again, as opposed to the things that are sort of sussed out by evidence and reason. And that's an unfortunate characteristic of the human brain, but it's a true one. So, so what is propaganda? And this is sort of a dirty word. Like, people go back to Evan Bernays and his book on propaganda, and they sense that it's not attached to truth. It's a utilitarian approach to the propagation of ideas. And so we have this negative connotation. It's defined as biased communication or non-impartial. It's the idea of promoting ideas, especially political views or worldviews. But fundamentally, what it is about is not the persuasion of the individual, but the persuasion of a consensus. The purpose of propaganda is to create a standard set of beliefs. It's the template that everyone is working with, right? And this is why, before I discovered Ron Paul, before I went on this adventure in libertarianism, I was essentially a run-of-the-mill Democrat kind of leaning Marxist, whatever, because I grew up in the Bay Area, California, and that was the consensus worldview of the people around me, and I hadn't studied it or questioned it or anything. It was just the water the fish were swimming in, right? And so this is what the purpose of propaganda is to color the water the fish are swimming in, so they don't even know where their ideas come from anymore. And despite this being used to our detriment as humans and as society by the past, by these authoritarian people, it's nonetheless the way the brain works. And it works because it's the way that humans work. And so I want to talk a little bit about this thing that I've been reading about called the backfire effect. I like to express it as that which you resist persists. There's one of Salin's laws is imposed order leads to increased disorder. So the backfire effect, this was a Dartmouth study, but there's been a number of other sort of research on the subject. And what they've discovered is when you present a person with evidence, facts and reason and logic that's counter to their position, and they can't refute you, they actually leave the conversation more certain of their position. Do you realize how absurd that is? We as human beings, most of us anyway, are not only not persuaded by facts, but persuaded of the opposite by facts. So I realize we're all here because we want to propagate these ideas of liberty, and we all sort of like have this vision of this world where we're free and there's a voluntary association between people, and there's less violence and less aggression and these things. And we go out into the world thinking that we're going to persuade people of these wonderful things we've been persuaded of. And we think, because we were persuaded by evidence and logic and reason, that we're going to persuade others with evidence and logic and reason, and that's not the fact of it. And if we're going to be, I realize I'm countering my own point here, but if we're going to be people of reason and evidence, we're going to have to put down reason and evidence because they're not working. So I want to encourage you just for a moment to entertain this notion that we have to put logic down. How do we propagate these ideas if we're not allowed to use reason, we're not allowed to use evidence, we're not allowed to use logic, because that's not what people respond to. The reason that what the researchers found with this backfire effect, the reason that it happens is because when you present a person with contradictory evidence to their worldview, and it causes this cognitive dissonance, it causes this psychological stress as a result of feeling the contradiction between what they're espousing and what they're doing, or reality and fantasy, their mind immediately clouds with the counter evidence, the counter arguments, the propaganda that are already carrying around. And even if they don't say it to you, even if you as a third party were to watch the debate and it would be obvious that this person had better arguments, inside the opponent's head is a louder voice than yours. And they've listened to that voice. They've listened to the cloud of garbage that they're carrying around all the time. And as a result, when they walk away from the dispute, they heard their own position louder than they heard yours. And so they're more entrenched in their position. So if we're not going to use logic, if we're not going to use evidence because these things turned out not to work, well, we've got to rely on something else, and we've got to examine what does work. And the researchers in these studies, they gave some sort of useful advice, I guess. I don't think that it's enough. They said things like, stay calm, because people are less likely to listen if you're raising your voice. And they said, give it time, because they said that a lot of times you won't persuade a person in the immediate moment, but then they'll walk away and they'll think about it, and maybe that will persuade them. This is speculation on the part of the researchers. This is like avenues for future research. They didn't actually demonstrate that this works. But what they did find worked, and I think this is really interesting, is appeals to selfishness. So if you're in a debate with someone and you're arguing, one of the things that they're worried about, they call this the persecution complex. If they accept your ideas, it means that their ideas are waning, which means in a sense that they're being eradicated or exterminated, and they feel this as a kind of intellectual genocide. And so they said that one of the things that works in persuading people in these sorts of disputes is an appeal to selfishness, to say, hey, if you understand and accept my ideas, there's benefit for you. Like maybe there's benefit for me, who cares? But it would be good for you to accept these ideas because here's the way that you might change it. So this is what researchers found. But this is just sort of one phenomenon. And I think that these researchers are ignoring the awesome power of propaganda. They're ignoring the awesome power of emotional appeal, of irrational exuberance, of glittering generalities. Okay. So I want to look at this. I want to look at propaganda as a tool, not as something to defend ourselves from, but something to utilize in our own efforts to propagate the ideas of liberty. So if you look around online about this stuff, you always get back to Edward Bernays, and he's this very sort of nefarious figure about how he controlled the population and whatever. And he got his start in journalism, and then went into advertising. Advertising is essentially the same as propaganda. It's the same thing. And so as free market people, let me get some water. As free market people who embrace advertising, I don't know why we have trouble embracing propaganda when it's exactly the same thing. But Edward Bernays did things like, people didn't eat bacon for breakfast before Edward Bernays. He was the one who popularized the idea that breakfast was the important meal of the day, and it's because a bacon company came to him and said, how do we sell more bacon? Well, he says, well, you got to sell more meals. He popularized this cigarette he called the Torch of Liberty because he felt, well, I mean, etymologically speaking, cigarette, right? It's like Smurfette, it's the female cigar. And so he said it was a phallic symbol that women had this Freudian need to possess a penis. And so he associated in his imagery and his advertising the cigarette with the penis, and he gave it to women. And he said, this will be empowering for you in the age of feminism to have your own penis. Maybe he didn't say that explicitly, but that's what's implied, and that was intentional when he did this, is Edward Bernays. And so it's this sort of use of psychology to persuade people not of anything rational, but of something maybe primal or instinctual that's inside them already. And he said that all propaganda needed to appeal to one of four things. And this says more about him than it does about truth, in the same way that Freud making everything about sex with your mother has more to do with Freud than it does with you. But he says, Bernays says that all propaganda should appeal to either self-preservation, aggression, security, or sex. That these are the sort of animalistic instincts that undercut our sense of reason, and that if you can appeal to people there, you can cause these sort of mass movements, and you can change consensus, and you can make the cigarette a commonplace thing in American culture, and you can make bacon for breakfast as American as apple pie, which is also propaganda. But he said toward the end of his life, and I think this is maybe his only redeeming quality, he said that if you can use propaganda for war, then you can absolutely use propaganda for peace. And I think that that's what we need to start looking at as a movement, as a mission, as a people. And so I want to talk a little bit about techniques in propaganda. Some of them won't apply to us, right? Because most techniques in propaganda require a scale that we're not capable of. Like, we're standing in the Roosevelt room right now. You think that's a mistake? Like it doesn't say anything about Roosevelt, or even which Roosevelt. But it makes it commonplace. It makes it the water the fish are swimming in, that the streets are named after these people, and the rooms are named after these people. And it makes it so that even without being presented with any facts or evidence or arguments, we psychologically begin to accept that this name must be important to people. And so maybe we'll be less likely to criticize it. Maybe we'll be less likely to question it. Maybe we'll be less likely to seek the truth about it because it's so ubiquitous. So one of the techniques in propaganda, this is my favorite, they call it ad nauseum. It's that you have to say things, you have to repeat yourself over and over again, catapult propaganda. But I repeat myself. And that's because, this is, what is it, the truth said 3 times, or a lie said 3 times becomes the truth. There's these expressions like that, and it's true. When people are bombarded with a message so many times and so frequently that they can't process it, they just accept it. This is something that people do. So it needs to be like a conspiracy of libertarians to present the same idea over and over again from many different angles. And I want to encourage you that when you're in conversations with people and you're in these debates and you have these like hot discussions around the dinner table with family and things like that, your job is not to persuade them. Like, if that's your goal, you've already lost. Your goal is to make these ideas so ubiquitous that they hear them everywhere. Like, yes, they hear them at their dinner table and they're not persuaded by them, but then they go and they hear them from their coworker. And you don't know the coworker. This is what I mean. It's this passive conspiracy. like they're going to hear it from their coworker. And then, you know what? They're going to hear it from Rick Grimes on Walking Dead. And then they're going to hear it from Donald Trump for some reason. It becomes this point where it's just everywhere around them. And they begin to feel like they're the odd man out, as opposed to at the dinner table where you're the odd man out. So give up this fantasy that you're going to persuade them. That's not how it happens. That's not what the evidence suggests. That's not what the research suggests. For the most part, all techniques of propaganda are logical fallacies, and you all know your logical fallacies pretty well, I'm sure. It seems like libertarians get them like tattooed on their arms and things like that, so they don't forget them. So one of them is to create this sense of inevitability, and they call this the bandwagon effect, or it's half of the bandwagon effect. And I really love talking about liberty this way. I like talking about it as like, my job is not to persuade you, my job is not for us to start a movement and a revolution and change the world or whatever. No, we've already won. We've won because it's true. And it's just a matter of time. Like, cultures and societies and things tend toward that which is true. And if you begin to engage people this way, not with an adversarial, I need to persuade you of these ideas, but with a, that's great that you're a Marxist, but it's inevitably going to fail. Like, it doesn't matter how much rhetoric you've got or how much research you've done. The inevitability beyond you and me is that my ideas are right and yours are wrong, and so mine are going to be the ones that win out, even if you defeat me in this debate, even if you walk away from this debate more convinced of your position. Mine is inevitable. And I honestly feel that way about liberty. Because it's been the sort of march of history to get closer toward the truth as we go. It's what science is about, it's what philosophy is about. And so I like to say to people, when I'm arguing with them about a libertarian issue, it's like, the reason I'm so convinced of these principles is because you can't even argue against them without using them. Like, every person who comes to me and says, oh, well, you want to abolish school because you want everybody to be idiotic and stupid. Well, they're appealing to a human need for a just society, for a free society, for a peaceful society. Whatever they're advocating it with coercion, but the outcome they want is our outcome. And the values they espouse are peace and voluntarism, even if they're contradicting themselves. So they can't even argue against liberty without using liberty. And so it's sort of an inevitability. Another one is the common man, they say, and that is to say that, we have this problem in the liberty movement of appealing to academia, and it's an appeal to authority, which is a logical fallacy, to say Rothbard said, to say Mises said, to say whoever. I don't care what they said. I want the beer-drinking, football-watching common person to have these ideas and understand them deeply. And until that happens, until it's so common that everybody has a hold of it, it's not a sustainable model for a society, because not everybody's going to be an academic. And not everybody is going to study philosophy and these things deeply, right? So another good one, and this is like the I want you thing. This is, they call it obfuscation and vagary. It's the idea that the slogans that you choose in propaganda should be simple, should be straightforward, should be motivating. If at best they're diktats, they're telling you to do something, but they're always vague, right? They allow the viewer to insert an interpretation that already appeals to them. You're not trying to persuade them to join up. They're just saying, join up, whatever it is. Like, it's not on the poster what you're joining and what you're doing. That's something you discover later. A good example is power to the people. This is such a colossally vague expression, and yet it's prolific in all activist circles. Power to the people, and we'll say out of one side of our mouth that power corrupts, and then out of the other that we want power for the people. And we don't imagine that this phenomenon will corrupt people. Like, we imagine that we've taken the power from the corrupt people, and now that we have it, now that we have the ring, it's pretty good. So power to the people is fantastic propaganda, because you're saying it to people, and so they're like, yeah, give it to me. but also you're not being specific about what power is, and not being specific about what it's being used for. And so it's this great sort of slogan where everybody will keep saying it over and over again, and it never really means anything. So where does meaning come in? Like most of these things, these slogans, these techniques, they're just techniques to propagate an idea. There's no sense of what the idea should be. And this is what I mean, it's a tool, and therefore we shouldn't refuse to use it. So there's hearing it from a third party, there's hearing it over and over again. And fundamentally, what's interesting, there's this tension between hard power and soft power. And libertarianism, anarchism, freedom in general, is generally attempting to use soft power to fight hard power. If you think of hard power as actual coercion, as actual physical force, as actual aggression, and soft power as persuasion and emotion and so anything voluntary, right? Like social pressure, things like that. Hard power depends on soft power. Like this is the thing that makes no sense about the way that society runs. Is that, yeah, there's a gun in the room. Yeah, every law is backed by the threat of force, and this is true. But that's not most of the time what gets us obeying laws. What gets us obeying laws is the custom, the surrounding culture that says obey laws. Like when I start, well, I break laws, sorry. My name is Davi Barker and I break laws. It's not police that come to me and tell me to obey the law. That happens occasionally, maybe speeding or seatbelts or something. But more often, it's that I tell a story that's just a playful anecdote about my life and the way that I live, and some random person or family member or somebody starts putting social pressure on me to obey the law. And I'm like, but that's a stupid law. Okay? And so I reverse and I say, well, you should break this law. You should consider breaking more laws. So, and this is, I use the inevitability argument here. You're already breaking laws. You don't know what the laws are. So, but there's this tension, right? Hard power and soft power. Hard power depends on soft power. It depends on the persuasive ability of people to horizontally manage themselves to obey the hard power. Otherwise, it's just not cost effective. There's too much overhead to put a gun in everyone's neck. And so libertarians say, what if we only had soft power, right? What if we only had the ability to persuade, to propagate, to push these ideas, and that was all you needed for a society to function? And so, like propaganda, fundamentally, it's used by governments to push and solidify their hard power, but it's soft power. It's the soft power of government. It's the soft power of big corporations and things like that. Advertising is soft power, and so I want to recommend that people reserve themselves with that, and that they stop going and looking to take the reins of hard power, and they instead look at all of the tools that they have that are soft power, and look at their day-to-day life and things like that. And so I want to point out that we're all already doing this wrong. I'm doing this wrong by standing here and talking here, and you're doing this wrong by sitting here and listening to me, because we're all already convinced of this. We're not here changing anything. We're here in a sort of cauldron of familiar ideas. And to propagate, you've got to get out of the liberty movement. You've got to get out of the liberty conferences. You've got to get out of the Libertarian Party. You've got to get away from your libertarian friends in your libertarian Facebook echo chamber. And you've got to find places where these seeds already exist. And this is why I'm talking about zombies. So I went from writing nonfiction about philosophy and politics and psychology and hard facts and evidence to writing about zombies, because I recognize the majority of zombie stories take place in a world where the government's already gone. And so if I'm talking to a person about zombies, about a zombie movie or a zombie book or a comic book or whatever, and I say, you know, how would you do property protection without a government? Like most people would recoil and they say, but the police are good and the military keeps us free and the government is already there and established. But the zombie fan is already engaged in a hypothetical scenario. The zombie fan is already engaged in a thought experiment of how do you do this now that all that's gone? How do you rebuild from nothing, right? And so I go to zombie conventions, and I speak at zombie conventions, and I talk on zombie podcasts, and I write these books, which, you know, if you're libertarians, you're going to pick up the subtext, but it's very subtle that there's a libertarian message in these books. And the reason for that is I'm propagating to not only the uninitiated, but the uninterested. I'm propagating the ideas of liberty to people who don't care about politics and are sick of it. Because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are going to win. Like, if government ever actually either rained down to a level that we were happy with or disappeared completely, all your political acumen becomes meaningless. And it becomes about, what are people into? What are they interested in? So I want to encourage people, if you want to take this seriously, stop talking to people who are interested in politics and go and talk to people who are interested in Star Trek or Ally McBeal or whatever. Like, you find these themes and the things that people already have, that's in the water they're swimming in, and you point it out to them, hey, this isn't coming from me. This is coming from this character that you already know and love and trust. And like, and this is how propaganda happens. It exists in media, it exists in television, it exists in advertising, it exists everywhere but a debate stage, right? If you go to watch the GOP debate, nobody walks away from those things ever persuaded by anything. Nobody goes and says, oh, well, you know, I like Marco Rubio, but because of this thing he said in this debate, now I don't even know that. I don't know enough of these people's names, so I don't pay attention. But when it's ubiquitous, when it's in all of their TV shows and all their radio programs and all their comic books and all their everything, when there's this conspiracy of this idea emerging, they just accept it without thinking about it. They don't have a conversion moment. It's just the air they're breathing. So that's what I want to encourage you guys to do. I mean, I realize this is not what this organization wants me to say on their stage, but you should not come here next year. You should find a fan convention. I mean, like, Facebook is perfect for this. If you look at, like, I saw this meme recently, and it's like Libertarian Society, and it's a picture from Fury Road, right? And it's like, oh, this dregs of the individualist in the desert. And then it's like Socialist Society, and it's a picture of Star Trek and the Enterprise. And like, this is total propaganda. Both of these universes are fictional. Neither of them are based on these principles. This is just like, this person has an idiotic idea they made a Facebook meme out of. But it's perfect propaganda, right? Because we all know it, hopefully. You don't have to know what Fury Road is, but for the person who already knows Fury Road in the context, and the person who already knows Star Trek in the context, it's instant. It's a slogan that makes sense immediately and reinforces these people's ideas. Now, in reality, Star Trek only works, and Gene Roddenberry said this, because of the replicator. Socialism only works when you get rid of scarcity, which was his point. And that's not possible. Even if you had a replicator, you'd still have scarcity. Not to mention, like, it's not democratic socialism, it's military socialism. Everything in Star Trek is a fleet, right? It's Starfleet, it's a war vessel. Everybody's a military hierarchy. So this is what they're saying that they want. And then Fury Road, yeah, the government's gone, but it's not a world free of aggression. It's not a world free of even taxation. So it's a total ad hominem. But this is the way we have to start thinking. We have to start thinking about where our principles and our message is already articulated in the common culture, and then exemplify it, right? Like the guy who stands up to Loki in the first Avengers movie and says, there will always be men like you. Like, that's perfect. Like, that should be a meme. So I'm going to encourage you guys to pick an interest you already have. And this is the thing, like I'm saying to you, we must stick apart, because we all have different interests. I'm going to go to zombie conventions. Maybe you guys like zombies, maybe you don't. Go to Star Trek conventions. Go to fashion shows. I don't care. But the point is, get yourself into an environment where you're the one coloring the water the other fish are swimming in, as opposed to swimming in school fish. So that's what I've got for you. Do you want to do questions and answers?
I guess I'd just like to echo, how important it is to get out of your comfort zone.
Oh, I'm saying go into your comfort zone.
Well, let me finish. Okay. Okay, in that sense, yes, go into your comfort. But go out with the people who agree with you on everything and find, I'm involved with secular humanists, and I find that they agree with me on a lot of stuff about what the state should not be involved in. And it's kind of easier to square that circle when you subtly point out other things that the state shouldn't be involved in.
Sure.
You have more credibility with them because you agree with them on their core thing. So I think that is a really good thing.
So let me use this as an example. You've got, I'm assuming, a meetup or something where secular humanists come together and they talk about the events of the day, right? Do you have another libertarian in this circle?
Yes.
So I want to suggest that you guys disassociate from one another. And the reason is because if you're there to talk about secular humanism and you want to talk about secular humanism with your friend, go ahead and do that. But if you want to use this as a venue for propaganda, here's what I recommend. Is you and your friend don't sit and talk, but instead you talk to people about these ideas, and they think you're crazy, and they scream in your face, and they reject you, and then they walk across the room, and that guy's saying the same thing, right? And it's this third-party effect that happens when things are ubiquitous, when things are ad nauseum. And those people will discover that they begin questioning themselves. Because it wasn't, if you gang up on them, that's going to trigger the backslide effect. That's going to be them entrenched against you because the two of you are trying to exterminate them, right? But if they go to you on this side of the room and they go to him on this side of the room, they start thinking, wait a minute, what school am I swimming in here? And they start questioning their own ideas. That's how it happens. Yeah.
It seems so cynical to think of people as having fish brains, and I understand that it's a very realistic way to deal with people now, but it also seems short-sighted. So if teaching people or coloring the water that they live in is great in the short term, but who can just sweep in and color the water a different way, and it's teaching people, helping people learn themselves to be critical thinkers, wouldn't that be a long-term solution?
Yeah, but not everybody wants to be critical thinkers. I'm not suggesting that everyone is a fish. I'm suggesting that a lot of people are fish, and that that's okay to be. That part of I lost the term. Division of labor. Part of division of labor in the human animal is that some of us are going to be philosophers and critical thinkers, and some of us are going to be bricklayers and muffin bakers.
But if they accept that, isn't that dangerous to think, oh, there's these schools around that could just go against me by the whims of another's
It is dangerous. Of course it is. Evidenced by the world we live in now. And this is why I think this is so important, is because we've relegated this tool to the sociopaths, and we've said, you guys can use this tool, we're not going to use that tool because we're too high-minded. And so they have the tool that works, and we have the one that science says doesn't. Does that make sense? So I'm saying we got to pick up the tools that work, and we got to compete with them in the realm where they're succeeding.
Seems so morally distasteful to me, but perhaps I'm too high-minded. No, you're very interesting, and I like what you're saying.
Yeah.
How would you describe what mindset a person has to have in order to hear ideas and not just have it all blend together and actually discern all the information they're getting to the point where they can tell what's actually accurate, what's just propaganda? And also, you studied philosophy a lot. There are a lot of aspects of philosophy that are more or less about teaching you how to use your mind to think efficiently and get right to the point of things rather than just kind of reacting to life and reacting to the things you hear.
So is the question, how do you make people curious?
No, the question is, how do you figure things out without like getting sucked into propaganda, I guess?
Oh, so this is the other side of the coin, right? So a person has to make an internal decision that they're going to align with truth and not whatever their comfortable fantasy is, right? And that's when like logical fallacies become personally useful. To go in and look at what are the tools that people use to manipulate, what are the tools that people. This is the reason to study it as self-defense, right? What is the intellectual manipulations I can defend myself from, and what can I do to validate facts for myself? But the person engaged in that practice is already sort of admitting a humility that they don't already know. And most people aren't doing that. Most people are afraid to do that. And so if you're doing that, if we're doing that, I mean, I feel like this is the one libertarians are good at, is assessing claims as objectively as possible so as to determine truth for themselves. And so, because that's our experience, we assume that that's other people's experience when it's not. So, how do you get a person to go from the jingoist to the person with the humility to say, I don't know, and how do I begin to know, and how do I use these tools? So that's like a whole other step that you want people to be at. I'm not so cynical as to say I don't want people to be there. I'm just admitting that they're not. And I think confusion is the answer. I think a sort of radical agnosticism is the answer, that it's almost like you're not allowed to have absolute certainty. I'm a fan of Robert Anton Wilson, and he said that he believed, or he used a model of belief that was on a scale from 1 to 10. And some things you're like a 6, you're certain of. Other things you're like a 2. But he said you're not allowed to have 0 and you're not allowed to have 10, because you might be a caterpillar in Japan dreaming all of this. And so he advocated sort of radical agnosticism. And I spend most of the things I advocate, I'm like, 7 to 9. But you have to always be willing to accept, if you want to be this person who's going to constantly be checking and rechecking and not propagandized, you have to be willing to assume that all of your deepest convictions are questionable. And you'll find, if they're true, that in the act of questioning them, you become more certain of them. But because they stand up to questioning. Am I helping this? Is this making sense? So I'm feeling for you. Like I get that I'm talking about a person who's in a different approach. Most people really want to be certain, right? Because certainty is a kind of addictive drug. And this is why people don't want to let go of it once they've found it, right? So when you start questioning their certitude, they experience that almost like going through a drug withdrawal. Like you're taking away the euphoria of certainty and causing them to return to the pain of agnosticism. I'm saying most of us should be much happier in a sort of constant state of low-level confusion and uncertainty.
Wow, that's a really interesting answer.
Thank you. Yeah.
So if we want to write some policy on this kind of stuff, on libertarianism, it's quite easy to follow examples. If we wanted to enact some propaganda, would you be able to provide some examples that we can use?
Examples of libertarian propaganda?
Yeah.
Commonplace stuff?
Yeah, like anything.
Well, again, I'm biased towards zombies.
Right.
But there's a tremendous amount of libertarianism. We don't even need to talk zombies. Let's just talk AMC. Walking Dead is on AMC. Breaking Bad was on AMC. Better Call Saul is on AMC. What's the capitalist one? Something Men.
Mad Men?
Mad Men, thank you. Mad Men is on AMC. AMC is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. It's libertarian propaganda. These are phenomenally popular shows, but the libertarianism is always subtle, right? So in Breaking Bad, for example, Hank is smoking a cigar, and Walter's smoking a cigar, and Hank says, you shouldn't do that, you have lung cancer. And then he has this diatribe about, isn't it funny what's legal and what's not legal? Before 1935, this would have been illegal, and now it's not, whatever. And he's saying this to a cop who gives the perfect statist answer about just following orders, essentially. And the CEO of AMC, his name escapes me at the moment, I wasn't expecting to go this direction. But he actually said at an entertainment conference that he wanted a world of complete free enterprise with no nation states. So this guy at AMC, he's an anarcho-capitalist, and he says this at an entertainment convention. So I have to believe that that attitude of his colors the people that he hires, colors the shows he decides to pick up, the writers that they decide to pick up, the stories and the comic books that they decide to put to cinema. And so Breaking Bad has all these libertarian themes. Better Call Saul has all of these libertarian themes. Walking Dead, even as a comic book before it was on AMC, has a lot of libertarian themes. And so people joke about the Ricktatorship because because this is not a democracy anymore. Like this is what Rick says to his people in Walking Dead, but it becomes a meme that's spread by people with no interest in libertarianism and no criticism of democracy. But if you see that meme on somebody's wall, it's a perfect venue to begin criticizing democracy because Rick said it. It's not you, it's Rick, right? So that's a great. I think that's a great example. Is any show you're already. What do you watch?
RuPaul's Drag Race.
I don't know that. Give me something I know. I'm willing to bet things appeal to you because they've already got these principles that you like seeing, right? So if you go to that fan base and you find that fan base that's not interested in liberty, but they're interested in the show, they're probably interested in the show because it appeals to them at some animalistic level too, right? And so you're almost just revealing it to them that these are the reasons they're interested in these things. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And how subtle does the libertarian message need to be?
So this is a thing, I was talking about this. I used to work for a company, or I guess a production studio, Silver Circle, which was this animated film, came out a few years ago, that was about rebels blowing up the Federal Reserve. And it was very explicitly libertarian, and there was dialogue in the movie that felt like it was coming out of academic textbooks. And general audiences were kind of repulsed by that. Like, libertarians liked it, but the general audience was like, man, I don't need a lecture on intrinsic value coming out of my hot rubber babe, right? It just didn't work with general audiences. Alongside Night is another great example. It's this film that we're imagining is a sort of libertarian propaganda, but it's so heavy-handed that it doesn't escape the echo chamber, right? Because it's like you have to be so subtle people don't realize that it's there, if that makes sense. Or it has to be coming from a believable character, and the audience attributes it to the character and not the author. Does that make sense?
Yep. Cheers.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on Ron Swanson and his character in Parks?
Oh, in Parks and Rec?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's a liberal Democrat, right? The actor. So, I love Ron Swanson. Ron Swanson's why I watched that show. And it's funny because it's not the motivation of the actor, and it's not the motivation of the writer, but it's the rhetoric, right? And so it appeals to me, even though it's like, this is an example where it is literally coming from the character and not the writer. But that does not, just because the writer and the actor don't believe what you believe, that doesn't mean that Ron Swanson is not a tool that you can use, right? Because the audience is going to be familiar with him, and maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong, and sometimes he's making fun of libertarians, which is fine. But it does make it, it makes it like a necessary part of the conversation. It's like in most sitcoms, there's a gay character, and there's far more gay characters than there are in real life, like in television studio, in TV, right? And that means that from the audience's perspective, even though the ratio is off, it means to them that it's part of the conversation. That if you're going to create a diverse cast, that's a slot that needs to be filled, right? And so the same thing is happening with the Ron Swanson character. If you're going to create a diverse cast, people are really dissatisfied with all just Republicans and Democrats. And so there needs to be these like alternative ideas. There needs to be sort of the Green Party character or the Libertarian character. And so people start inserting libertarians because it's interesting, because it's outside the norm, because it allows them to bring up new ideas that the audience isn't bored with. Like, the audience is bored with mainstream stuff. And so this is sort of why Ron Swanson is entertaining. To go on a little bit of a tangent, since it's comedy, I said this earlier, I wrote this book, Authoritarian Sociopathy, which is about psychology of obedience and authority. And those researchers found something sort of very similar, and that is that the research is dire, the research is cynical. The research suggests that any power given to any person almost instantaneously produces a person who is less compassionate, who is more of a hypocrite, who is more willing to lie, who is more willing to steal. And it isn't that corrupt people are drawn to power, it's that giving power to random people corrupts them. But there was one study on hypocrisy, and it discovered that the opposite psychological effect began to happen when the subject viewed their authority as illegitimate. So if the subject viewed their power as legitimate, they had all these negative psychological effects that made them into wretched people, or at least tend that way. But if they were given in the experiment the sensation or the impression that they didn't deserve to be in the authority camp, they were supposed to be in the lack of authority camp, and they were put here by mistake, then they have the opposite psychological effect. It becomes harder to lie, it becomes harder to be a hypocrite, it becomes harder to lie, cheat, and steal. And so mockery, I think, is one of the most powerful forms of propaganda that there is, because then you don't have to get in a confrontation with a person about whether your idea is right or their idea is right. You can just say, man, all of this is so ridiculous and funny, I don't know why you lend it any legitimacy. And that undermines the whole thing. So mockery, satire, comedy, the Ron Swansons of the world, I think, are excellent propaganda. Yeah.
When it comes to studying different techniques of soft power and groupthink, are there any books that you would recommend to understand the subject further?
Soft power and groupthink, books I recommend. No, not off the top of my head. I mean, it's interesting, like most of my, this is maybe the function of the modern world, but most of my research doesn't come from bound books anymore. It comes from this sort of like wide net I cast over a lot of sources. So yeah, I can try and come up with something though. Okay. Anything else? Yeah.
You've always kind of looked at the world through the same lens, or is your thought evolved over time in terms of
It's never really evolved.
Agnostic?
Like me personally?
Yeah. Like, what would you say kind of pointed you on your current path? Was there a moment in time or experience that you?
So I mean, in this story, where I'm doing this homelessness experiment, I began to kind of feel a little wretched because I was panhandling when I didn't need the money, and I was doing street performance, which was fun for me, but I was being given money that I didn't really need. And I started to sort of feel like the unintended consequence of what I was doing was that these other people who maybe did need the money were getting less because I was getting more. Like there's this sort of praxeological effect that people only have so much that they're going to give. So I started giving the money to the people around me. And I started panhandling with a sign that said take or give. And so I had to play with coins, and some people would leave coins, and some people would take coins. And I was sitting there, kind of like a lotus position or something, and an officer came up to me, and he told me that I wasn't allowed to sit on the sidewalk. But first he said I wasn't allowed to panhandle. And I said, well, I'm not panhandling. This money people have left here for other people to take. You can take all of it if you want it. It's not mine. and he says, well, you're not allowed to sit on the sidewalk. We have this lie law. This was in Santa Cruz. Before it was a big thing in San Francisco, it was an ordinance they were testing in Santa Cruz. And I pointed across the street, and there's this, it's called East West Bookstore. It had a Buddha statue out in front. And I said, what about that guy? He said, well, that's a statue. And I said, well, I think I have a First Amendment right to emulate the prophetic practice of sitting quietly and thinking to myself. And he says, I don't want to argue the Constitution with you. And I'm like, great. So like this is one of my very first experiences with police and with authority, besides school, besides education. And the unwillingness of him to listen to reason, I hadn't interacted with a lot of police doing this. And luckily Santa Cruz cops are nicer than most cops because most of them are stoners. But, that was a turning point for me because it got me thinking about money, that there's somehow like a difference between sitting here with money in front of me and sitting here, just sitting here, right? And that the money itself, even though at the time I already understood that it was fiat, that it was meaningless, that it was this token, that it was, aluminum with a magic wand waved over it, that it changed laws, that it changed what people viewed as right practice, that something that is perfectly acceptable both legally and morally to most people becomes illegal the moment money is involved. And so that was one of them for sure. But as far as the first moment, I couldn't tell you. As far back as I can remember, the world just seemed insane. So I was always open to any alternative theory.
Right. Real quick follow-up. Do you ever see yourself going back? I mean, yeah, I feel like you're full steam ahead at this point, and you feel like you're headed in the right direction.
Going back to what?
Where you came from, your way of thought, your school of thought, prior to having these moments of clarity and realization that maybe anarcho-capitalism is the way to go.
I mean, I go back and revisit them from time to time, and it softens my vision of what I think anarcho-capitalism is going to look like, because there will still be socialists in a free society. There will be people who think that that is the best way to organize themselves and to provide for people, and so they're going to experiment with that. Even if you took the force away, those ideas are still in people's heads, and they're still going to enact those ideas, and you got to let them. And one of the reasons you got to let them is they might prove you wrong, right? Force, coercion, it distorts any experiment. It distorts any empiricism that you want to apply to human behavior. If they're under force, it's not a valid experiment anymore. So you got to take the force out of it to even get to what we're talking about when we're talking about human nature. But we still might be wrong, and there might be some element of humanity that means that some other model will be more effective, if that makes sense. And even if they are wrong and we're right, they're not going to change their position until they've completely explored it, right? Forcing them to change their position is the same as forcing us to change our position. We're just going to entrench. We're going to have the backfire effect because we're going to feel exterminated, right? So yeah, having come from that background, having come from a sort of like cultural Marxism, it still colors the way that I think now. And it's not because the ideas I find valid. It's because the people I find valid. They're human beings, and they have these ideas, and they're carrying them, and they want the freedom, the same that I want to give to them, to explore those ideas for themselves, and that's valid in a sort of like diversity of humanity, diversity of strategies, division of labor, sense of the word. Does that make sense? Yeah. Like, I don't want to exterminate the opposition.
Right.
Like, I just want them to let me prove them wrong.
Right. Yeah.
Is that it? Yeah.
My question would be like, other sector, who colored the water that you swam around in? More or less have
Who colors the water that I swim around in? Yeah, this is really meta, but it does. I mean, it's almost impossible. Language does. This is how deep it is. I've studied a couple of languages. I studied English, German, and Arabic, and merely in the act of translating, it changes your lens, right? Because words, we get into grammar, logic, and rhetoric as libertarians, and we act like if we've got a solid definition of something, then our argument must be absolutely true. But the moment that you translate that into another language, that language is dealing with different grammar, it's dealing with different definitions, it's dealing with different rules of engagement in the linguistic realm, right? And so the language that you live under is sort of the first color of the water. And so one of the things that I like to do is I experiment with alternative Englishes, and you can all do this very easily. It's called E prime and I prime. E prime is English without is. You're not allowed to use is anymore because we're embracing absolute agnosticism. You can only say how something is measured by something else. This is much more scientific. So you can't say that light is a wave. You can say light appears like a wave when measured this way in this experiment, but it also appears as a particle when measured this way in this experiment. You can't say what it is anymore. You can only say how it's measured, how it appears, how it seems. And if you translate your regular thinking English into that, you'll realize that sometimes you can't do it because you haven't measured it. Right? It's just something you're asserting is an is. And that'll change your relationship with assumptions. The other is I prime. I prime is English without I or me or myself or whatever. And this forces you to rephrase and reframe all of your requests, all of your ideas, all of your assertions from the other person's perspective. And that also has, it changes you cognitively. So you don't have to learn a new language to experience this fact that language colors your lens. You just have to change the rules a little bit. And then by looking, it's sort of like, I like to talk about the astrolabe. Do you guys know what the astrolabe is? It's this device you use in navigation. It's actually your eyes. Let's just talk about your eyes. The only reason that you have 3D is because you have two perspectives, right? If you only had one perspective, you only had one eye, you wouldn't be able to navigate in three-dimensional space. The astrolabe is a navigational tool designed to do this on a ship, to navigate to an island in 3 dimensions instead of 1 or 2. So part of getting to the bottom of how your lens is colored, part of getting to the bottom of where your biases are and what assumptions you're making, what mistakes you're making, is embracing the idea that you need 2 perspectives. And if both of those perspectives have to be you, that's okay. You need 2 points of focus to see in 3D instead of 2. So if that's it, thank you guys. I'll be around. I have a table in the lobby here. I'm booth number 43. Actually, there's 2. There's Muslims for Liberty and Bitcoin Not Bombs. We're right next to each other, so I'm sort of dual fisting here. But thank you guys for coming. I hope this has been helpful and enlightening for everybody, and I'll be around if you have personal questions.